Bubbles, bubbles, bubbles. Big bubbles, deep bubbles, shallow bubbles, or my favorite, tiny bubbles. I've been wanting to build a bar or a liquor cabinet for a while because my pantry is really small and it would help free up some space in there. And recently I also got some power carving tools and thought this would be the perfect opportunity to use them and incorporate power carving into a furniture build, into a bubbly bar cabinet furniture build. And since this build was going to be for me, it started with rummaging through all my offcuts that I had on hand, and well, I just had enough. But they were all different thicknesses from being left over from several builds. So as you see, I started by milling them down into the same thickness, which we came out to 1 inch thick. Then I glued up one panel for both doors so I could have the continuous grain. I wanted the grain to run horizontal because I thought that would allow the bubbles to pop as they run vertically up the doors. Once the glue had dried for a couple of hours, I unclamped the piece and proceeded to clean it up by removing this glue squeeze out, and then I taped off the knots on the other side so I could fill the knots and voids with epoxy. And if you've ever worked with knotty alder, you know there are a lot of knots. I like tinting my epoxy black with a trans tint dye because I like how it makes the knots pop in the finished piece. Filling the knots can be a process. Fill, pop the air bubbles, fill again until it won't take any more, and then wait. In this case, I waited overnight, and the next day I set the panel aside and started building the carcass to the bar cabinet. Since I was planning on painting the carcass black, I used 3/4 inch sanded pine plywood, and I had Home Depot rip it down to 13-inch strips for me, so when I got home I only had to cross cut them down to size at the miter station. I then proceeded to label each piece so I knew exactly what was what and where I was going to put those pocket holes. And if you are interested, I have full build plans available on my website. They include dimensions, cut lists, tool lists, and materials needed, plus a few more building tips you might not see here. And I'll leave a link in the description box below. Next up, I routed a rabbet into the top and bottom pieces of the carcass. That way when I attached the backer, it would sit flush and not be seen from the sides. When I do this, I always check my setup on a practice piece first. Also, be aware which side of the plywood you want to be seen and where you will be placing your pocket holes when routing. That way you'll have the least amount visible when you're all complete. Now that I have the rabbets, it was time to edge band the carcass pieces. I'm doing this before assembly because one, I thought it would be easier working with the smaller pieces rather than the whole piece at one time. Plus two, the 30-second or so that the banding adds to the plywood would make the side pieces not sit flush with the top when it was assembled. So this way, when it's already on there during assembly, I can make sure that everything is flush. I like edge banding because it's a simple step that not only makes a carcass look more like a solid piece of wood, but it also gives me an opportunity to get some use out of my iron. Now on to joinery. I used 3 3/4 inch pocket holes in each piece because they were only 13 inches wide, and my Craig Foreman made super quick work of drilling all of these. Next up, I double checked my dimensions, making sure I was going to have enough room for the wine bottles, and remembered that I needed to trim all the shelf pieces down to 12 3/4 inches so that the backer would sit flush. So I quickly ran those through the table saw, and once that was complete, it was assembly time. For assembly, I used a lot of clamps and a lot of squares to line everything up. Oh, and the plans on my website also have my recommended order for assembly so that the least amount of pocket holes are visible. For the upright divider, I didn't use pocket holes because they would be hard to hide, and instead used 1 1/4 inch wood screws. And I screwed them in from the bottom piece of the carcass and into the shelf above that would be connecting it, because that would be covered by the pull-out drawer. Now that the carcass is built, we can move on to some of the awesome features of this build. First up was the pull-out shelf. I added this because I wanted to be able to open a bottle of wine at the cabinet and serve it from there. I made this with a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and trimmed it out with 1.5 by 3/4 inch knotty alder. Since there wasn't going to be room for a pull or hardware, I made a little jig and drilled a half circle in the drawer front as a pull and then installed the drawer into the cabinet. Now on to the second awesome feature of this cabinet, the wine racks. I started by ripping down some knotty alder into strips and then cut them to size and then assembled them using brad nails and wood glue. Again, all dimensions are in the plans on my website. Now we're getting to my favorite part of this build, the doors. I trimmed them by tracing the carcass outline on them and then using an edge guide and my circular saw to trim 3 sides. Then I used my table saw to cut that in half to make 2 doors. After sanding, I gave a nice round over to the edges and installed the pulls. I did this before carving because I didn't want the bubbles to end up where the hardware was supposed to go. And once they were installed, I got really excited about this project. Oh, and a little nervous because the doors looked so good and I was afraid I might mess them up carving. But I had a plan and I was determined to make this a bubbly bar cabinet. So I did a little bit more practicing, printed out an inspiration picture, and started carving. I ended up using 3 different size round burrs from Saburrtooth, a 1 inch and a 1/2 inch round with a 1/4 inch shank, and then a 1/4 inch round burr with an 8 inch shank. Which brings me to the sponsor of this video, Saburrtooth, the maker of these superior power carving tools. Even though I'm newer to power carving, you can tell these are quality and they cut so well and clean. Plus all parts are made in the US. I definitely see more power carving in my future. Power carving these bubbles might look easy, but it was a lot more work than I thought it would be. I think I carved about 500 bubbles on these doors, but it was definitely worth it and fun. Oh, and very sawdusty. Once I had the doors where I liked them and they were done, the only things left to do were to finish each piece and put that all together. So I added a faux shiplap backer, primed and painted the carcass, finished all the solid wood pieces with Rubio Monocoat in natural, added metal legs and metal wine glass holder, and attached the doors. And this is where I had a learning experience. The pull-out shelf wouldn't open. The doors were in the way. I had the wrong hinges. I had no idea. So I ended up taking these hinges off, doing some research, and finding out that I needed some 0 protrusion hinges. So I got those ordered, got those installed, and now I have a bubbly bar cabinet. This build was so fun from start to finish, even with the learning experience. I'm happy that I get to look at this piece every day and that it freed up so much space in my pantry. I again want to thank the sponsor of this build, Saburrtooth. You have awesome power carving tools. Now who wants a drink?